Over a quarter century ago, my father stood before you to accept the nomination for the presidency of the United States. So many of you came into public service because of him. In a very real sense, because of you, he is with us still. And for that, I'm grateful to all of you. I owe a special debt to the man his nephews and nieces call Teddy. Not just because of what he means to me personally, but because of the causes he has carried on. He has shown that an unwavering commitment to the poor, to the elderly, to those without hope, regardless of fashion or convention, is the greatest reward of public service. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not a political leader, but I can speak for those of my age who have been inspired by Teddy to give their energy and their ideas to their community and not just to themselves. Thank you. Thank you. In that ongoing effort, young people, and not only the young, but all like-minded citizens, all of you, will be guided by the honorable and unyielding example of the senior senator from Massachusetts. He has shown that our hope is not lost idealism, but a realistic possibility. America is better because of the leadership of Edward Kennedy. Thank you. May he continue to guide us for many years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, my uncle, Ted Kennedy.
All right, Steve, so can you tell the viewers a little bit firstly about the title? What made you come up with that title, America's Reluctant Prince?
I think it sums up John's life. He was born into royalty. And his father, was the modern president. His mom was a cultural icon. And people looked at John as an American prince. But he never embraced that title. John once told me he was two people, that he was John, just John, a typical, though privileged member of his generation, but he had a role to play his whole life. And the role he played was that of John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. And he understood why people imposed that role on him, but he was very determined, and his mom was very determined that he develop his own identity separate from all these expectations that had been imposed upon him. So he's reluctant in that he wants to. John's whole life was a struggle to define his own identity, to find out who he was separate from what the public expected him to be, what his family expected him to be. And that's the journey that I chart throughout the book. And of course, the great irony is that it's really in the final year of his life that John's willing to embrace the expectations that have been imposed upon him. He's, for the first time, talking openly about running for office, but he was going to do it on his own terms and not just because other people told him, expected him to do that.
So can you talk about, first of all, John growing up? What did he tell you? Did he talk anything about those years of him growing up in the White House? Obviously, he was 3 years old. He probably didn't really have a huge memory of all that. But what did he speak about that? And obviously, the trauma of that JFK assassination. We all know that little salute of little John when he was saluting JFK in the casket. So
first of all, he never spoke about the assassination. Mm-hmm. He never talked about his father's death. And at one point he said something, I don't understand why everyone's so fascinated by the way my father died. So it was just never discussed. he didn't have many memories of a child, being a child. One story he told me that was revealing was, we've seen the pictures of John under the desk
Right.
in the Oval Office, and John told me why he was there. And he was there because his mom would not allow him to chew gum, but his father would give him gum. And John would hide under the desk in case his mom walked in so she wouldn't see him chewing the gum. So, he had very vague memories of his father. And and I think it was an issue with him because, he was at a restaurant one time with his co-founder from George magazine, Michael Berman. And Berman said to John, it must be odd. Everybody in here knows who you are, but you don't know a soul. And John said, no, the odd part is that they remember and I don't, which is that all these people have memories of his father, but he doesn't. And I think that was an issue for John. So much of his identity was wrapped around his father, and he didn't have very many memories of him. He was able, when he talked about his father, he clearly was well read in historical literature about his father. And when I first met him, I was a graduate student at Brown, and I taught him in a class in American political history, and we talked about his father. My first lecture I ever gave was about his father, and he always referred to his father as President Kennedy. And as time went on, he referred to him as my father, because I think he became more comfortable with his father and his legacy and his own identity. He was willing to embrace him. And by those last few years, when he talked about his father, he called him my daddy. So I think that with John, over time, came to be able to embrace his father, while also, when his identity was secure enough and he knew who he was able to allow his father in, so that he could both be himself and also embrace his father and his father's legacy. Not that he always embraced him, obviously, and loved him, but in terms of the struggle over his own identity, I think he became more comfortable with his father.
Steve, I know you talked about the identity struggle of John, but did you also see that there was a trauma? Obviously, anybody that's father was murdered, that's going to be a huge dent on their life, even if they were only 3 years old, growing up without a father and only a mother in the household. I know Bobby tried to be a father at that young age, and then obviously he was assassinated. Was there a lot of trauma? Did he ever talk to you about that kind of growing up in that kind of mess? Basically, it was really sad.
No, John never would talk about his life in that way. I mean, he understood that being a Kennedy brought lots of privileges as well as a lot of pain. But I did talk to a child psychologist about this, because I was trying to understand it. One thing about John, everybody who knew John, he was reckless. If you ever drove in a car with him, you knew he had a reckless streak to him, and he loved doing these dangerous things, like flying around in this contraption where that ends up breaking his leg, or going flying when he should not have gone flying.
Right.
And I tried to understand why that is, and if there was any connection between John's childhood. And this child psychologist explained to me that it's not just one trauma. And in John's case, you're absolutely right. It was a series of traumas. It was the assassination of his father, and then Robert becomes like a father figure. Then Robert's assassinated. Then his mom marries Aristotle Onassis, who John became very fond of. And then he ends up dying. They end up getting divorced, and a pretty ugly breakup at the end, and he dies. So John went through a series of traumas. And she was saying that one of the personality traits that develops from that is, first of all, a belief that you have to live life to the fullest, because it can be snuffed out at a moment's notice. And also, it's almost like a moth toward a flame, like you're drawn toward danger. And I think, to me, that helped explain things about John, but I don't think John ever thought about himself or his life in that way.
Can you talk about Jackie Onassis Kennedy? And, after JFK does get assassinated, it seems like, and from what I've learned in school and watched on TV, she was very protective of John and Carolyn. And, even in the White House, she was protective of them. Why was that? Obviously in the White House, but even afterwards?
Well, she was determined that her children lead as normal lives as possible. And that was true in the White House, and it was true after they were out of the White House. And one of the things that I was able to do with this book is I sued the Secret Service and got access to all these Secret Service files for when John was, in the White House and had a Secret Service detail. And he had that Secret Service detail right up until through high school. And so I got hundreds of pages of Secret Service documents about John's protection. And it gave you a fascinating glimpse into John's mom and how, on the one hand, she was very concerned about John's security, and she wanted to make sure that the Secret Service kept him safe. But on the other hand, she also wanted John to live the type of life that a normal person would be. She didn't want the Secret Service helping him if he fell, or she didn't want John to ever turn around and see a Secret Service agent. There's all these letters that she's writing to the Secret Service complaining. This goes back to when they're in the White House. She didn't want John to hear the crackle of the Secret Service radio wherever he was. She didn't want him to ever turn around and see guys in suits and sunglasses following him. She wanted him to be, as normal as possible. But there's this incident in Central Park where John had his bike stolen, and she was furious that that could happen to John, even though he's protected by the Secret Service. And there is this correspondence between her and the head of the Secret Service about how this could happen. And she said, her reference was, you catch counterfeiters. Why can't you protect my son? And they explained to her that it's different. When they're doing counterfeiters, they stake people out. But with John, she has already placed all these limitations on how close they can be to him. And if given those limitations, and given the fact that she wants him to live a normal life, they just can't provide that type of protection from things like having his bike stolen. So I spoke to Clint Hill, who was Mrs. Kennedy's Secret Service agent when she was in the White House. Clint Hill was the one, and if you ever seen the Zapruder film, he's the one who runs and jumps on the back of the limousine as they're speeding toward Parkland Hospital. And he remained close to her through all those years. And he was actually the supervisor of John's detail for most of those years after the White House. And he just said, he cared for her a great deal, but he said she was very difficult when it came to the demands that she made on the Secret Service to protect John. So she wanted John to be safe, but she also wanted him to lead a normal life. And those two conflicting demands often led to conflict with the Secret Service.
So, Steve, can we talk about, fast forward, obviously John grows up, he does go to Brown University, he did take the bar, I believe he finally passed the bar, but can you talk about your first dealings with John? I know you said the first time you met him was that lecture on his dad. Did he come up to you afterwards, and or did you even know he was in the class? How did that all play out?
Right. So the class that I was a teaching assistant in was American political history since 1945, and I knew John was at Brown. I'd seen him walking around campus, usually with a gaggle of girls, around him. But I assumed he would never take a class in political history where we would discuss his father. So the professor made us all give lectures. And before the class began, before we knew who was in the class, he asked me what I would like to lecture on. And I was always fascinated by the 1960s and by President Kennedy. I'd studied European history as an undergraduate, so I didn't really know a lot about modern America. So I said, I'll give the lecture on the Kennedy administration. So he's fine. So he pencils me in. It was actually around this time of the year, around March. And the first day of class, I'm in the back of the room and I'm handing out the syllabi. Students come into class, and there's a bunch of students. I see this big mane of brown hair. I'm like, God, please no, don't be John Meredith. There it is, it's John. So the way graduate school is set up is you want someone to be your mentor, and I wanted this professor, James T. Patterson, very famous political historian, to be my mentor. So I was going to give the first lecture I'd ever given in my life. I was going to be giving it in front of this professor who's very demanding, who I wanted to be my dissertation director, my advisor. And I'm going to be giving it about a guy whose son is going to be sitting in front of me, right? So I probably spent 4 weeks writing the lecture and 6 weeks practicing it. I mean, I knew this thing inside and out. I could do it backwards practically. There's no way I was going to screw this up. So the morning of the lecture, it's 11 o'clock in a building called Manning Chapel, which is no longer a classroom at Brown. And I get up on the stage, and I had a podium in front of me, and I remember my hands were shaking so much that I put them in my pocket. And I look around, and Patterson's right in front of me, but there's no John. So that gave me some sense of relief. So right, like 30 seconds before 11 o'clock, the back door swings open, and there's John comes, strolling in. And because all the students are sitting in the back of the room, he comes and sits right in front of me. I mean, he's 10 feet in front of me. So I had the lecture in front of me, but I had memorized it. My plan was to just. So my first lecture began with like this. It went, and I got to the point where my little voice in my head is saying, look down, you have the lecture right in front of you, just start reading it. But by this point, I was, some people, when they face a difficult situation, they reach deep down inside, you find that inner strength. Yeah, I'm not one of those people. I hyperventilate. So I'm about to pass out. I had to blurt something out. I had to say something. So my first lecture, the first line that I ever delivered about President Kennedy in front of his son was, President Kennedy had no moral scruples. I have no idea where that came from. That was not what my lecture was about. It was not what I thought about Kennedy then. It's certainly not what I think about him now. But for some reason, that's what came out. And I'm like, I just ruined my life. But fortunately, there was a student in the back of the room. I don't know who it was, a female voice. She laughed. And the whole classroom erupted in laughter. They thought it was a joke. So I went on and I gave the real lecture I was giving, which was anything but Kennedy had no moral scruples. And afterwards, John came up and he shook my hand. He said he enjoyed the lecture. But that was his sophomore year. I had very little contact with him his junior year. And then in his senior year, we were both frustrated athletes. He played rugby. I used to help out with the baseball team. And so we both had access to the varsity weight room. And I was going every day at 3 o'clock, and then John starts showing up at 3 o'clock, and we just started lifting weights together. And then one time he came up to me in the library and he said, Stevie, he's the only person in the world who ever called me Stevie. He's like, Stevie, we should get some cardiovascular exercise, not just lift weights. And Brown just has squash courts. Let's find a place that has where we can play rugby. So we found a place in Seekonk, a big gym in Seekonk, and twice a week or so, we hopped in his little blue Honda. We went over there and we played racquetball and we lifted weights. And then we would always stop and get something to eat at this fancy new restaurant that just opened up around that time called Wendy's. And of course, John never had any money, so I'm paying for his hamburger. So that's where we really bonded. It was in that senior year, and then we just stayed in touch years out. We just stayed in touch all along. I used to help him write speeches. We would get together when I was in New York. By this point, I went to Oxford, then I went to Oklahoma, and I would be coming into New York. I was working for the History Channel. I'd be there for weeks at a time, and we would just have dinner, sometimes one night a week, sometimes 2 nights a week, and we would just talk about history and about politics. And and I spoke to him the Tuesday before he died. So I was never a part of that inner core. I was never invited to Hyannis, and I never went on trips with him. But I was always, so when John died, there was one of his friends was holding that week, that horrible week before the memorial service. People every night, a friend of his would host some type of event where people would get together, and I went one night, and I was so nervous because I didn't think, whenever I was with John, it was just the two of us.
Yeah.
I didn't know a lot of his other friends, and I was thinking, I'm going to show up, and the police are going to escort me out because no one's going to know who I am. So I go to this door. I walk around the block a couple of times, work up the strength to go, and I knock on the door, and this guy answers, and I said, "Hi, I'm Steve Gillon," and he goes, "Oh," and he made this motion with a racquetball. He goes, "The professor." And I realized that's the role that I played for John. I was his racquetball playing professor. And that's the role I always had with John. We would always talk about fairly serious things.
Yeah.
He didn't talk about his relationships. I didn't talk about mine. We talked about politics. We talked about his father. We talked about, books that were out about his father. And that was sort of the nature of my relationship with him.
Did you guys hang around Thayer Street? I'm not going to put this in, but because obviously Brown's on Thayer Street.
Yeah, no,
No.
John, we would hop in John's car. We would have some meeting point, and I would meet him and hop in his car. We'd go to Seekonk and play racquetball and work out at the gym. And sometimes we would, but I rarely hung out with him I'm trying to think, that's an interesting question. I never hung out with him on campus. It was always off campus.
Okay.
We'd meet on campus, but go off campus.
Okay. Obviously we all know the love story of John falling in love. Can you talk about that with him and Carolyn Bessette and how that formulated, how they fell in love?
There's lots of different stories about how they met and how spontaneous it was. I spoke to one of Carolyn's friends from college, and they were sitting around. She told me the story. They were sitting around one day, and they were talking about guys and who they wanted to marry, like who they were in love with. And Carolyn pulled out a picture of John and said, "I'm going to marry him."
Wow.
Which makes you think that maybe their meeting was not as spontaneous as some of the stories that perhaps she was. And I think what happened with Carolyn, though, and you see this now with, Harry and Meghan Markle. And so she had no idea what she was getting into. And people say, "Oh, she should have known as a Kennedy." Well, you just don't know. You just don't know until you're in that type of situation. And the paparazzi, the media just went berserk. I mean, John had a fairly decent relationship with them up until that point. They annoyed the hell out of him, but he had a respectful relationship with a lot of them, and all that went out the window once he married Carolyn. They tortured her. They absolutely tortured her. They would walk down the street backwards in front of her with their cameras, and they call her all these horrible names because they're trying to get a reaction out of her. A reaction from Carolyn makes more money than just Carolyn walking down the street. Right. And she became a prisoner, and it created a lot of tension in their relationship. It made it really, really difficult for them.
Right. I want to start going to George Magazine as we're winding toward the end of the interview, Steve. What made John want to start George Magazine?
Well, for the magazine had a lot of fashion sponsors, but the magazine itself was a mix of politics and popular culture, which in many ways it was natural for John, right? His father was president of the United States. His whole family's in politics. Right. His mom was a cultural icon. John was fascinated by popular culture. And I think that what he tried to do with the magazine was to find this. He wanted to make politics interesting and engaging for people. So he was looking for a venue to make that happen. And that's what George Magazine was, to make politics accessible to people who did not feel part of the political system. It was designed to humanize politicians. John saw the way people treated his uncle. And, he said his uncle became a caricature of himself. Yeah. And so he did interviews with, George Wallace and a lot of, he interviewed a lot of people who had clashed with his father. And, he made them to be, he did a thing with Jesse Helms. I mean, he made them full human figures and not just stereotypes. So I think it was a natural progression for him. And it also allowed him to dabble into politics a little bit and get a sense of whether it's something he was really going to be interested in doing. And the magazine started out like gangbusters, and it ran into a lot of problems for various reasons. And near the end, I mean, the week that John died, Bessette, his partner, had told him they were going to cut ties with him. So John was busy in those last months looking for other sponsors, traveling around, trying to raise money, talking about, I mean, he was way ahead of his time and talking to people about creating an online magazine, which simply didn't exist back in 1999. So that, one thing I didn't know about John that I discovered, there's lots of things, but one of them was how difficult that last year of his life was. His marriage was in trouble. George Magazine was failing. His best friend and cousin, Anthony Rodswell, was dying. It was a really difficult year for John. And even though I saw him often that year, I had no idea.
Yeah. So he didn't show his emotions.
No. I mean, he did. I'm sure he did to some intimate friends,
right?
Especially female friends. But for the most part, John was just an incredibly strong guy, strong emotionally, strong physically. He was positive looking. He was upbeat. He always, John, for John, the glass was always half full. John would see a glass that's a quarter full and think it's 3/4 full. I mean, he was an optimist. He was always optimistic and forward looking. So looking back on it, these were obvious burdens, but he had pretty broad shoulders, and John was, the week that John died, he was writing the eulogy for his cousin, Anthony.
Wow. Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah.
So Steve, my thing is, we've heard many rumors that John was obviously Hillary Clinton, after the Clinton presidency, was looking to get into politics. We all know what happened. She ran for U.S. Senate in 2000, won that election. There was talk of John running for that seat, and there was discussions between the Clinton campaign and John back and forth about whether he was going to run. But I was always told that if John was going to run for something, he would run for governor of New York and not for the U.S. Senate. What is your take on that? Where did you see John running? Was it the Senate, the governorship, or even President of the United States one day?
Well, that's, let me clarify the Senate thing. So it happens, Daniel Patrick Moynihan resigns, the Senate seat in New York is opening up. A lot of Democratic figures, labor leaders came to John and asked him if he would run for the seat. John thought about it, but he had seen his members of his family. He was like his father. Like, he didn't want to be a legislator. He didn't want to be a senator. So he turned it down. And it wasn't until John said he was not going to run that Hillary announced that she was going to run. She was waiting for him to make a decision. She was not going to try to run against John in a primary. So John walked away from that, even though had he wanted to run, I think he would have been a shoo-in for the seat. Right. John was that last year was talking about running for governor in 2001 against Pataki. Mm-hmm. And John always saw himself as an executive. Not as a legislator. So I think what John, listen, if life never turns out the way you expect it to, but had John run for governor and won in 2001, had he been a successful governor, he very likely would have considered running for president in 2008. And if John runs for president, does Barack Obama run? I mean, you can do the what ifs forever, but John would have started out in politics with a lot of advantages and some disadvantages. But we never got to see how that would play out.
Right.
But the thing is, I want to just clarify, there's a lot of these conspiracy nuts out there who claim that Hillary was responsible for John's death and that she was trying to get him out of the way so that she could run for the Senate seat. It's all just pure nonsense.
Yeah, the QAnon stuff. You're right.
Yeah.
We've heard a lot that John's still alive. If you
Right, he's
find them,
coming back.
Steve, yeah, if you
Yeah, I
find
know.
them, Steve,
I
let
wish-
us
yeah, I'll
know.
let you know. I'll let you know.
Okay.
I can tell
Okay.
you one thing, all these years later, he probably still has a full head of hair.
Okay. Can you give us some more quick fun facts about John?
Fun facts.
Mhm.
He was duck-footed. He walked like a duck. What other fun facts? He was funny.
Yeah.
Had a great sense of humor. He's a great mimic. He used to imitate his uncle. I mean, he could have you rolling on the floor imitating his uncle. Uncle Teddy, that is.
Right.
What else? He belonged to probably 8 gyms when he was in New York. I mean, anywhere he was in the city, he could always pop into a gym. Worked out. I used to work out with him. Worked out just like a fiend. I mean, he was just John was sickly as a kid. He was skinny and sickly. His cousins used to pick on him. And John, I think one of the reasons why John was so proud of his body was because that was the one thing he created on his own.
Yeah.
He built that physique that he had. He worked on it his own. He didn't inherit it from his father or his mother. It came from long hours at the gym. And John was proud of his body. And he loved showing it off.
What,
Because when we played
ahead.
touch football,
Yeah.
John was always skins. No matter how cold it was, John was skins.
And it could get cold.
Yeah.
Anyway, we hear about the flight. Obviously, the flight that ended JFK and Carolyn's life. Can you talk about that? What happened? And I know you spoke about the risk taken because he didn't have enough hours as far as training hours to pilot that plane. And obviously there was bad weather in that area. Why would he do that? Was it just the risk taken? Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, he was qualified to fly the plane. He wasn't instrument qualified.
Okay.
And what happened that night, there was heavy fog. And, there's the FAA did a very in-depth investigation. You can find it online.
Yeah.
Spatial disorientation is, when you're in fog like that, you can't tell what's up and what's down. You don't know where you are. And John was turning the plane. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't level. So as he was turning the plane, he was going down into a downward spiral. And by the time he realized, it was too late. But it would have been a very harrowing last 20 seconds of his life.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's so sad because I do think he would have been a great politician, and I think he would have, been a great governor or senator. I want to talk about this with the last 3 questions. What do you feel like is John F. Kennedy Jr.'s legacy is?
That's a tough question to answer. I think that John was ahead of his time in anticipating the merger between politics and popular culture. I mean, Jon Stewart, and a lot of these comedians, these people who, I mean, they are the fulfillment of where John saw the culture moving. He recognized that there was a way to make politics interesting and fun. So I think he was ahead of his time in anticipating this merger, which obviously, was consummated when Donald Trump, the reality TV star, becomes president of the United States. What more of a merger between politics and popular culture could you have than with Trump? And by the way, John and Trump were not friends, and there's all this stuff online about how they were such good friends, and that's all a figment of Donald Trump's imagination.
If John did make it to the governorship, you know him personally, you talked to politics with him. We look at Ted Kennedy, who died in 2009 in the Obama administration. He talked about universal health care. That was his life's goal. What was John's goals if he did run for politics? What would you say personally offhand? Do you think he would be a real true progressive?
John was his father. He shared his father's instincts about politics. And his father was really fairly moderate. It's difficult to compare a progressive today to a progressive back in the early 1960s. But remember, JFK ran as the centrist candidate. In 1960, his chief rival was Hubert Humphrey, who really was more like Ted Kennedy than. President Kennedy was skeptical about using federal powers. And these conversations I had with John, his ideas were evolving. They weren't fully formed. But he clearly was not going to be his Uncle Ted. He was not going to be this outspoken progressive. I think John would have been, the one thing John cared passionately about was race. And I think he would have been very progressive on issues of race and racial reconciliation. But on most other issues, I think he would be, more middle of the road than certainly his uncle was.
As we end with the last question, what should people take from this book?
I think they should. My goal in writing the book was to make sure that John is not remembered as the hunk flunks or the sexiest man alive, that he was a guy of real substance, that his life was not always that easy, that we think of John as this, he's handsome and he's wealthy and he has this, but he struggled a lot with with who he was and what he wanted to do, and the expectations, this heavy burden of expectations that had been placed on him from the moment he was conceived. And that's the story. The story is about this really decent, caring, compassionate guy who is born into a royal family, has expectations placed on him, and turns out to be, as one of his friends said, disgustingly normal. Most those expectations crush most people, including members of his own family. And that John had far more expectations placed on him because he was his father's son. He was the namesake. And John managed to deal with these expectations and turn out to be a really healthy, normal guy. And I think that's his great accomplishment. His great accomplishment, and his mom's accomplishment as well, was that he turned out to be a normal, down-to-earth, incredibly decent and compassionate person, despite all the tragedy he had confronted, and despite all he could have very easily turned out to be a spoiled brat. And there was nothing spoiled about John.
Right. Thanks so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it today. And I assume that people can get the book at their local bookstores and Amazon.
Absolutely. As they say, find our bookstores everywhere.
Okay. Thanks
and
so
I love
much.
your Rhode Island accent. So
I appreciate it, Steve.